the moose population reached 200,000, all from 4 animals, in about 80 years. It's one of the most remarkably successful wildlife introductions ever made, anywhere. And it all started somewhere on the Miramichi in northern New Brunswick. 90 years ago, somewhere near here, a small band of moose were rounded up and shipped to Newfoundland. Now, the Miramichi is best known today for its fishing. It's one of the best salmon streams in the world. But it's moose country, too. At least it used to be. The Newfoundland moose apparently came from around Newcastle or Chatham, now a part of Miramichi City. I wondered if the story of the capture of the moose and their shipment to Newfoundland survives here. The crew who caught the animals must be long gone, but has their story been passed on? Is it remembered? Are there still moose on the Miramichi? I figured a good way to find out would be to talk with wildlife biologist Bob Curry.
I wasn't around at the time it happened, of course, but certainly I've heard of the story about the moose introduction to Newfoundland, and certainly the man that was in charge of the capture operation, so to speak, who didn't have a tranquilizer gun like some of us have these days, but his relatives are certainly right here on the river, and they are well aware of the story, and are proud of it.
And what's his name?
Well, the old man was Mr. John Connell, that looked after the total operation.
Was it actually near here on the Miramichi, on the banks of the Miramichi?
It certainly was. It was in an area just off to my right here, across the river, the Bartibogue region, the headwaters or the tributaries of the Miramichi, the Bartibogue River, in that area where old Mr. John Connell captured the moose probably on a March day in a big moose yard, and brought them out and had them shipped over to Newfoundland.
And he'd be buried somewhere around here, I guess.
Yes, he certainly is. He's buried just over my shoulder at the church, the Bartibogue, the St. Peter and Paul Church, right at the mouth of the Bartibogue River, where he took those moose.
Moody's Point, where the Bartibogue flows gently into the Miramichi, lie the pioneers of this country. Here in the historic churchyard of St. Peter and Paul. Sure enough, among the tombstones, the name of John Connell, the man who caught the moose and brought them to Newfoundland. In the background, the mouth of the Bartibogue River. The Bartibogue is a beautiful stream. It flows gently, a main tributary of the mighty Miramichi. It was to this river many of the Irish settlers came early in the last century. The earlier wave of Scots had land grants to the main river, the Miramichi. Later immigrants pushed back the frontier, here on the Bartibogue. They homesteaded here, cleared land, farmed, fished for salmon and trout, hunted the moose, and in those early days, the caribou. Life must have been pretty rough and ready for those sons and daughters of the pioneers. But the land was rich in natural resources, and life became a bit easier for succeeding generations. John Connell, the son of an Irish couple who immigrated here in 1837, did well for himself as an outfitter and tourist promoter. Best known as the man who caught the moose for Newfoundland, he once also caught live fisher for breeding purposes. It's said this beautiful home was built from the sale of 4 of these animals to the government. Jack Connell is John Connell's great-grandson.
He was an enterprising man, and he knew how to promote himself and to make a good living out of guiding and hunting, fishing, and had a good imagination, I would say.
I can see why the Newfoundland government of the day would come to a man like that and say, you're the man we need to catch us some live moose.
Yeah.
Do you tell me the story of what happened then, as you've heard it?
Yeah, well, as I remember, my grandfather was a young man, probably in his early 20s, and he, of course, would be very eager to be part of this, and they went several miles inland near the railroad track, which runs between Bathurst and Newcastle, and it was near there that they caught these moose. And also my grandfather and his father, John Connell, went to Newfoundland with the moose. I remember that story very well, and that was quite a trip for them. to not only to catch the moose, but to accompany them to Newfoundland.
This was a remarkable feat at any time, but especially back then, I would think.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Was it written up in the papers and talked about quite a bit, or did it just stay as a family yarn?
Oh, it's well known in the community, and a lot of people, still talk about it. Like grandparents tell their grandchildren about it, and I don't think it's part of the lore of Bartibogue, the capture of these moose which went to Newfoundland.
So the story of John Connell and his famous band of moose catchers is still remembered here on the Bartibogue, still part of the lore of this stream. It's still a special place to the Connell family. John's descendants still canoe the river. These young men are his great-great-grandsons, just out for a paddle or a run on the river, and perhaps a trout or two. Overfishing has drastically reduced the trout and salmon on the Bartibogue, but the old stream retains its pristine beauty. They say there are still moose on the Bartibogue. We kept glancing at the forest that line its banks, hoping one would put in an appearance, but no such luck, not in the middle of a hot summer's day. John Connell eventually settled on the Bartibogue where the Bathurst Road crosses the river. Note the old covered bridge. The years have brought quite a change to the old Connell homestead. In the new home, built in almost exactly the same spot by the Bishop family, we met Carol Bishop, another direct descendant of John Connell, the moose catcher. She too heard stories about the exploits of her famous great-grandfather.
Oh yes, and I often hear people talking about John Connell, and most of the old-timers are always telling the stories, and they sort of remember people talking about him.
Mm-hmm. He was a fairly famous man because of what he did with the moose, I guess.
Yes, he was with the moose, and he was a guide, one of the top guides in New Brunswick.
Yeah. What kind of stories did you hear about him when you were young?
Oh, I heard different stories from the old-timers telling me about catching the moose and putting them in the barn and then taking them to the train and shipping them off to Newfoundland. And his tame moose that he used to use in the sleigh going to town.
Oh, you've got an old barn out here by your home. Would that have been the barn that he kept the moose in?
That was the same barn, yes.
What about your photographs? Now you've got some there of your is it of your great-grandfather? Or?
Yes, it's my great-grandfather.
Well, lots of fish on the river, too.
Yes, compared to today. This is my great-grandfather here with the tame moose Tommy.
This isn't the moose that came to Newfoundland. This was the...
No, this is a tame moose that he had for his own purpose.
So these pictures now were taken around the turn of the century, I guess. What's happening here?
This would be my great-grandfather with Tommy. He would be calling a moose.
Oh, that's a birch bark cone that he's using to call the moose. It's a big moose here. And this one, Carol, looks like the pictures they used back in Newfoundland to tell the story of the introduction of the moose. But you think that's Tommy, do you?
Oh yes, I think it's Tommy when he's so tame.
This must have been quite the hunter's paradise in those days.
Yes, I think it was. Fishing also. Interesting photos of the exciting early days on the Bartibogue. The days when you could catch all kinds of huge salmon on the river and ride to town on a moose. More about John Connell's moose roundup and about the demise of Tommy, the tame moose, when Land and Sea returns.
You're a what?
An adult bull moose can weigh up to half a ton. It's not an easy animal to wrestle to the ground. To capture a small herd of them, way back at the turn of the century, with the benefit of modern dart guns and tranquilizers and helicopters, was quite a feat. But that's what John Connell and his hardy crew of Miramichi woodmen did back in 1904. John Nowlan was born not long after the capture and shipment of moose to Newfoundland. Raised by the Connell family, he often heard the old fellows describe the time they lassoed the moose.
There was a bunch of moose gathered together about 3 miles from where I used to live there. And the snow was deep that winter. And they felled trees all around the moose, made a fence. And when they got them all fenced up, They all stayed together, the moose did. They felled trees, keep in. And then they went back with the horse and sled and high sideboards on and hauled them out one at a time.
They had tranquilizers then, did they?
No. Big strong men, I guess.
What happened to the moose now once they caught them and brought them out?
Well, they put them on board the railroad in Chatham. Took them to the railroad cars there, put them in there. Well, there was one cow died and dropped dead, put her aboard the train in Chatham. Scared.
There was quite a journey in those days to go to Newfoundland from here.
It must have took a week or 4 or 5 days. Take them that time, maybe.
And so began the long trip by train to North Sydney, the boat ride, and the second train journey on the Bullet through western Newfoundland. 2 other moose died. The remaining 4, 2 bulls and 2 cows, were released in the forest near Howley, not far from Corner Brook. Reports say the New Brunswick moose were in good shape considering what they'd been through. Now all they had to do was adapt to this strange new world, to go forth and multiply. They found themselves in a moose paradise. Limitless range, an abundance of food, lush, deciduous growth in spring and summer, lots of balsam fir for winter browsing. But it wasn't just the abundance of food that made the New Brunswick moose prosper in Newfoundland. Because there were no deer on the island, the moose didn't have the deadly brainworm to contend with. There are no wolves in Newfoundland, so little of any predation. And there were few roads and few people, especially back here in the country. Under such conditions, they spread and multiplied quickly, eventually building to incredible densities. Strangely enough, there seem to be no photos of the moose that went to Newfoundland. This photo turns out to be of Tommy, the tame moose. An interesting episode in itself. Imagine harnessing a moose and going to town for groceries, going moose hunting on mooseback. Strange things happened years ago on the Bartibogue. Tommy's death is still a bit of a mystery.
There's also different stories surrounding how Tommy came to his end. The Connells had this moose for about three years, I believe, and it was well known here and beyond, the story of the moose. But it was out, I don't know, on its own, or it wasn't far from the Connell home, but it was eventually shot, and there are different stories about who shot it and why it was shot. One story I heard was that a jealous neighbor didn't care for the fame that it was bringing to John Connell, and that's how it came to its end. But there are other stories too, so that sort of remains in the midst of the history. Who shot Tommy the tame moose?
Mystery on the Bartibogue. Who shot Tommy the tame moose? John Nolan is as close to the event as anyone. Here's his version of what happened.
So anyway, he decided when the cow got 2 and 3 years old, he figured, well, he might get a little calf from the moose, give her bread. So anyway, he took her in there to the other side of the big Bartibogue, would have really seen the moose there. A bit further on, just closer to Skidilly. And he tied her to a tree off the road, about 100 yards from the highway. She was bald, she was no condition.
Tommy was in heat, ready to be bred, and there were lots of amorous bull moose on the Bartibogue, only too willing to respond to her mating cries. It would only be a matter of a few hours, and nature would take its course. But John Connell didn't know his brother was in the same area, hunting moose.
So Mr. Connell, anyway, he left the moose tied to the tree, and he came back out, hit her for home, so he said he'd go back and get the moose after dinner sometime, or wherever he went. And anyway, John, this other Connell, his brother, was coming out, and they seen a moose cross the road, and he didn't take notice with the bull or which way it was, but anyway, he seen the moose crossing quite a piece ahead of him. So he went out and he stopped and he looked to see the moose off the road. Up, bang! Shot the cow.
Pet moose.
Moose were important to John Nolan's generation here on the Miramichi and the Bartibogue. Important as food and in the making of snowshoes and moccasins. But those days of living off the land were quickly drawing to a close. Not long after the introduction of moose to Newfoundland, the New Brunswick moose population began to plummet. The once prolific forests of the Miramichi and the Bartibogue seemed empty. The woodland caribou became extinct by the 1920s, and many feared for the future of the moose. So while the descendants of the New Brunswick moose were multiplying and spreading throughout Newfoundland, the ancestral stock back home were having a hard time of it. But biologist Bob Curry feels the New Brunswick moose are beginning to bounce back.
Yes, moose have always been here, as far as we know, for many, many hundreds of years. But of course, there would be cycles in populations, ups and downs. And there was a time for about 25, 30 years when the hunting season was closed here in the province. And but in 1960, the officials felt that it was time again to open the season. And since that time, moose have been gaining in stature all over the province.